I spent hours in the cold capturing this image, using a dedicated Astro camera for the first time ever. But was it actually better or just more complicated? Because honestly, this didn't go as I expected. If you ever thought about upgrading to a dedicated Astro camera, this video will definitely save you some time and maybe even some money. I switched to the garden because the wind was killing me up there, but I'm not sure it's even better in here, but anyway. Unlike a normal DSLR, this dedicated Astro camera is built for capturing the night sky. It connects straight to the laptop or something like the ASI Air, and it's way more sensitive to light. Sounds amazing, right? But there's a catch. It's also way more complicated. Tonight I'm using the ZWO 585 MC Pro one-shot color camera, which houses the popular IMX585 Sony CMOS sensor. Setting this up for the first time was interesting. Instead of just turning my DSLR and using the settings I know from basic photography, I had to worry about stuff like gain. What even is gain? At this point I was already missing how simple my old setup was, and I think that I might have just spent more time googling stuff than actually shooting. But eventually I got a few first images coming through and they looked good. Okay guys, so I just started the polar alignment process. We got some clouds coming in, but they should be going away in a bit, so hopefully we can get this one sorted. Now I'm just carefully like moving the screws that move the azimuth and altitude and stuff like that, and I'm just refreshing. This is how it looks like. Hopefully the wind will tone down as well. And this plate's all failed. Those little pesky clouds are ruining all the fun. Okay, so I finally got everything working. I will set up auto guiding through the ASI Air on the tablet, and then I will show you first subs. And I decided tonight we are going to be shooting the Monkey Head Nebula. So I'm really excited. My first ever picture with this Astro camera. So let's see how it goes. So I'm setting up the auto guiding right now on the tablet. It takes a while. It does some measurements and move the scope around a bit. And when it will be spot on, I hopefully will get a good guiding, and then the first subs will be coming in, so I'm excited for that. Okay, the first sub is about to come in. Let's go, I'm so excited. Right here, look. 3, 2, 1. Here it comes, watch guys. Bam! The Monkey Head Nebula. This is it. I will probably shoot around 2 hours on it, and then we'll see how the final image goes. But I'm super stoked, I'm excited. Okay, so we are here now in PixelSight. This is only one sub exposure straight out of the camera. You can't see much, but that's because it's in linear and we need to stretch it. If I upload this simple auto stretch here, you can start to see the nebulosity just from the single exposure. There's a lot of noise, but we can work with that. This is the full stack after some blur exterminator just to sharpen those stars and get the image a bit tighter. You can see there is a lot of details, especially in this region. Also a lot of noise, but we can fix that with noise exterminator. After this I applied some saturation and then Star Exterminator, and that's just an amazing tool to separate the stars from the nebulosity or from the object. And you can like really push the editing after that. After this process, I usually take these two images to Photoshop because I know the program better, and there I apply more saturation and the creative part of the process, like bringing out the different colors and stuff, and we get the final image like that. So, was it worth it? Honestly, it depends. Here's the truth no one tells beginners. This setup is not beginners friendly. If you just want to go outside and take cool pictures of the night sky, a normal DSLR probably would be still a better option. But if you are willing to deal with the complexity, the results can be incredible. Pros and cons. Pros: better image quality, lower noise, better details. And for the cons, complicated setup, you need a laptop or a mini PC, and there's a steeper learning curve. For me, this was equal parts exciting and also frustrating. I definitely struggled a bit, but now I can clearly see why people switch to dedicated Astro cameras. And this is just the beginning. In the next video, I'm going to capture a galaxy and see if I can push the setup even more. If you are getting into astrophotography, definitely subscribe because there are many videos coming, and I'm super passionate about this hobby, and I just loved space ever since I can remember. Join me on this journey and let's figure it all out together. And if you ever used Astro camera before, tell me down in the comments what I should try next. I'm Ardin, and thank you for watching. Until next time, clear skies.